Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's session of Nils Klim Webinar Series on transitional justice in settler states, challenges, contradictions, and possibilities. This webinar is financed by the Nils Klim Prize, organized together with the ERC-funded MARCEN project. And my name is Valpuri Alanen. I'm a doctoral researcher in the University of Turku, part of the MARCEN team, and I will be hosting today's discussion. Our topic today is Gendered Settler Colonialism Perspectives from Sápmi. And we're joined by Professor of Sociology Astri Dankertsen. And before I welcome our speaker, a few technical notes of today's session. So this webinar is recorded and it will be later published online. And today, at the end of the session, we aim so that we have a few minutes time for some questions from the audience. So if you have any questions to Professor Dankertsen, please write your questions down to the chat. And you can, of course, send the questions in throughout the session, but we will have the Q&A at the end. And when you're asking questions, please be mindful and respectful of others. Thank you. And without further ado, let me welcome and introduce our today's speaker, Astri Dankertsen. She is a professor of sociology at Nord University, and she is specialized in Arctic and indigenous studies with focus on Sámi perspectives. Grounded in decolonial and feminist theory, her interdisciplinary research emphasizes indigenous-led approaches. Astri Dankertsen currently leads two research projects, IndHome and SoTrust, that focus on indigenous homemaking, survivance, and reconciliation. The latter project, SoTrust, which has very recently begun, is researching trust in South Sápmi in relation to the Norwegian Truth and Reconciliation Commission process, and is thus also very topical to this webinar series. Thank you, Astri, for joining us today. It's really an honor to have you here.
Thank you for inviting me.
Let's go immediately to today's topic and discussion. So could you please explain to us, how do gendered perspectives change the way we understand settler colonialism in Sápmi in comparison to more traditional analysis of colonialism?
Well, I think just to kind of state the obvious, I think to have a kind of gender perspectives on kind of any topic is about including everyone, kind of both men and women and people that fall into other categories as well. And I think to kind of include the whole spectrum of people in the group is kind of very important in kind of gender research in general. So it's often about also kind of open up for also taking for granted marginalization also of certain voices like kind of women and queer perspectives and other perspectives that are often kind of sometimes kind of taken for granted as kind of universal, while in fact sometimes also might be male dominated perspectives. So that's kind of, yeah, also in a nutshell, what's important when it comes to gender perspectives in relation to Sámi and indigenous studies. It's all about kind of including kind of more voices than often kind of the kind of traditional research in the past that often were done by kind of male professors on kind of other men in out there in society. So yeah.
Thank you. We'll get a bit later back to the question of marginalization. But can you also then give a bit more practical examples that how colonial power continues to shape everyday life in Sápmi today, and particularly in gendered ways?
Yeah, I think kind of to start discussing kind of gender perspectives also in relation to, for example, colonialism. It's also important to remember that colonialism also had certain gender dimensions in the past. If we start, for example, with the introduction of kind of Christianity to Sámi communities, that often involved also a more kind of patriarchal, male-dominated worldview, and replacing kind of very kind of male-dominated religion, kind of that kind of replaced the Sámi traditional religion that also kind of replaced a lot of, for example, important Sami deities and women's role in relation also to religious practices. So I think kind of to start there kind of very early, but also how also colonialism has kind of changed also the way the Sami everyday life has been in relation to, for example, when you look at, for example, reindeer herding, that it used to be kind of a very, very kind of family-oriented activity where kind of family and relatives work together, where both kind of, yeah, men and women and children were all taking part. While the introduction of a more kind of capitalist-oriented economy also involved kind of also a masculinization of kind of also the traditional economy in Sami communities that had kind of also marginalized women in relation to, for example, traditional practices like reindeer herding. So that's also why kind of there are kind of fewer female reindeer herders, because of this kind of also how capitalism also has kind of changed also how the family is connected to traditional practice. And then, of course, have kind of other issues, like, for example, that because of this transition, also the role of kind of women in relation to kind of taking care of children has also been important. So I think also when they talk about, for example, revitalization of language, women and also traditional kind of knowledge like doji and other kind of traditional practices, kind of this also female a role of being kind of a knowledge factor in relation to children. It's also, I think it's important to remember. So I think there's kind of a lot of different kind of issues to discuss, but of course the problem when it comes to Sami gender research and also indigenous research on gender is that there is so little of it. It's a lot of the research that has been done on Sami-related issues has focused, for example, on very kind of extreme issues, like, for example, sexual abuse and violence and these kind of bigger problems. Like, while, for example, research on everyday life today is still kind of somewhat lacking. So I think that's also something that I hope will be done more on in the future.
Just a short follow-up. Are your current research projects more focused on these everyday levels or more?
Yeah, in the Indome project, we have kind of a focus on kind of everyday life practices. We have some of our researchers working on more kind of historic issues with kind of focusing on, for example, welfare policies and policies regarding kind of housing and centralization and things like that. While, for example, me and some of the other researchers that we are working more kind of on with kind of interviews and observations of home, we also kind of include kind of gender dimensions of everyday life practices and relations, and so and that's also kind of interesting to see how kind of what kind of activities that are, for example, important for women and men, and
Yeah, thank you. That's super interesting. So get back to the question of how the colonial power shapes everyday life. What I know it's a super complex issue, but what kind of resistance there is among the Sami communities?
I think you have, for example, like I've written about in some of my texts, is, for example, kind of the resistance towards, for example, sexual abuse and violence in Sami communities. You have, for example, the so-called Tysfjord case here in Norway, where also there was kind of a case related to sexual abuse in Tysfjord municipality, where also a lot of women, but also men, that were victims or kind of families of victims of sexual abuse, took part in this newspaper articles in the biggest newspaper in Norway, to also focus on the fact that this is kind of why hasn't anyone done anything about it? And it was kind of not only kind of a critique of their own community, but also for example, the police, the school, childcare services, social workers, kind of that a lot of people, and also kind of people that professionally work with this had just kind of ignored this issue for such a long time. And I think that's also kind of a very good example of kind of how also kind of gendered violence and sexual abuse is also something that is kind of engaging Sámi women, but also Sámi men.
Yeah, indeed, and that's also
Yeah.
quite a good
And also,
example.
for example, if you look at, if we also going to look at, for example, political representation in the Sámi parliament, when Aili Keskitalo was elected as Sámi president for the first time in 2005, it wasn't a coincidence that the Sámi, there were suddenly a lot of female representatives in the Norwegian Sámi parliament back then. It was a result of an active mobilization from Sámi women all around, kind of in different local community to get women on to the kind of position in and on the list so that they could be elected for the Sámi parliament. So that was also kind of a good example that is often forgotten on kind of the Sámi women mobilizing to be politically represented.
Exactly.
And that also has had a lot of results when it comes to kind of politics, because Aili Keskitalo, for example, and a lot of the other women that were elected back then, and also kind of up until today, have also focused more on politics that has also somewhat kind of feminist agenda, so to speak. So I think that's also something that is kind of important to remember, that a lot of these things hasn't happened kind of coincidentally. It's something that has happened because women they have mobilized and worked to be represented.
Yeah, exactly. And that has been such an important factor in the Sámi mobilization from the very early times as well. Now we've talked about this kind of development and things getting more inclusive, but going back to the marginalization that you mentioned earlier, are there still voices or perspectives that are marginalized in mainstream discussions about Sámi rights? And if yes, why does it matter?
I think kind of there's a lot of issues that are marginalized in a way that I think kind of sometimes is a kind of good reason for marginalizing them. For example, talking about kind of, for example, the relation between men and women, for example, in relation to children, for example, and in relation to kind of reindeer herding. I think there's a lot of kind of private compromises that people have done, kind of just to kind of get hold the family together and for practical reasons. But that I think that has also kind of consequences for kind of also how gender relations are shaped in Sami communities. But I think kind of to get more research also on kind of everyday life and not only kind of the extreme or kind of it's important because it says something about kind of often kind of the taken for granted issues in everyday life and not kind of only kind of the extreme or the big problems in life, even though research has the tendency to be a very kind of problem focused. But I think also when it comes to, for example, queer perspectives in Sami research, there are some examples of researchers and also students working with kind of queer related issues. And I think also to some extent, when you look at kind of the history of Sami gender roles and that kind of there's a lot of researchers that also focus on the fact that kind of in the past there were kind of more acceptance towards more kind of fluid gender roles and kind of sexualities that kind of wasn't kind of the traditional norm oriented sexualities. And I think that's something that I think kind of is also important to remember, even though kind of the Sami society today is also a result of kind of course, the the influence of traditional Christian values, and that has kind of, even though it's something that as it's a part of the colonization of Sápmi, today is also an important part of the Sámi culture itself. So it's kind of colonization also creates sometimes quite kind of complex realities, where also sometimes kind of the elements that the colonization has brought also becomes a part of the culture itself. So sometimes when you kind of criticize, for example, traditional gender roles for being oppressive, and especially focusing on kind of Christian values, for example, that for some people also might be kind of important part of their kind of Sámi identity and Sámi sense of belonging and Sámi worldview, while at the same time kind of representing something that also was a part of the colonization. So because this has been going on for such a long time.
Yeah, exactly. That's a really really good insight, and also shows the complexity of the topic that we're talking about today. I had a question also about the traditional livelihoods of Sami communities and cultural understandings of gender and how they intersect, but you already talked quite much about that in your talks, but is there still something that you would like to include about that topic? Or
I think kind of also when it comes to kind of gender roles in relation to kind of livelihoods, it's sometimes kind of often easy to forget, for example, things like berry picking and kind of activities that are also kind of has been kind of historically also important for people when it comes to kind of livelihood. For example, berry picking has been a very important kind of economic source of income also for a lot of Sami families in the past, and still is kind of very important for people. So a lot of these kind of small activities that nowadays don't really count as a kind of a job is still kind of important, and it's something that also kind of a lot of women take part in, of course, in addition to, of course, men and so it's kind of these activities that kind of has been an important part of also how people relate to the landscape and knowledge about kind of nature and also kind of the more kind of spiritual parts of that is related to kind of how the landscape is used and how kind of you relate yourself to kind of your ancestors and kind of the more kind of spiritual part of the landscape is also important, where also kind of these kind of smaller activities in life is also very important for women, even though kind of that's kind of you have kind of less and less people that are kind of involved in kind of this typical kind of traditional livelihoods, such as, for example, reindeer herding. But I think kind of it's important to remember that also women take part in a lot of the activities, even though it's not kind of their main source of income. And that's often kind of easy to forget that kind of it's.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and also seen in research.
Yeah.
So that
and also when it comes to, for example, food production and kind of taking kind of care of their children and the activities where the children take part in, and kind of so it's a lot of kind of activities that while kind of it's not kind of there that we have a tendency kind of in our modern life to think about kind of what's important is kind of your kind of main source of income, kind of the job that you have. Well, kind of that's
yeah, exactly, and that connects to the capitalism that you mentioned at the beginning, and then again to colonialism, though. So this really everything comes together, and the gender aspect. Well, so what do you think that why is it, in your opinion, important that then people outside Sápmi care about the gendered settler colonialism, and especially what responsibilities it raises for society as abroad?
Well, I think kind of, especially when it comes to professionals, like, for example, healthcare workers or teachers, it's, for example, in my research, I've done, in one project that I had, I did interviews with kind of healthcare professionals in working with mental health in Sámi communities. And what I found there in the interviews was that they're, especially for those that don't know that much about Sámi culture in general, they often tend to kind of work with stereotypes rather than Sámi realities, so that they have kind of a very kind of stereotypical way of kind of thinking about what it is to be Sámi. That kind of, for example, and and also stereotypical kind of ways of looking at gender in relation to Sámi communities, like, for example, that and then you have kind of positive and negative stereotypes often mixed together, where on one hand Sámi women often have been seen as the kind of strong and independent, and on the other hand you have kind of the stereotypes about Sámi men as kind of, and these stereotypes have kind of a tendency, when you look at indigenous communities all around the world, to be kind of extremely similar. That the kind of the men there are kind of brutal, violent, drunk, oppressing women's rights. They're kind of lazy, and these stereotypes also have a tendency to be used from outsiders towards Sámi men, and maybe especially kind of in cases when you have kind of mental health care, where people are in such a kind of extreme crisis in their life, and often the crises are often also linked to gendered experiences, like, for example, violence or sexual abuse, or other kind of experiences that also have kind of gendered aspects in their life, that kind of, when you just kind of, as kind of an outsider, only kind of look at these stereotypes, you kind of sometimes end up kind of just reproducing this very kind of sometimes kind of paradoxical views on Sámi women and men, that women are on one hand kind of strong and independent, but then they're also kind of victims of this kind of abusive, violent, brutal Sámi men. And it's something that is kind of it's this kind of, they're both kind of strong and weak at the same time, that just reproduces these stereotypes about kind of what it is to be Sámi, that isn't necessarily linked to how it is in real life, and something that kind of real Sámi and real Sámi communities necessarily recognize from their own lives. And these are kind of the dangers of kind of reproducing these stereotypes, that they might also sometimes kind of come true because they're reproduced by kind of teachers and healthcare workers, and also sometimes by people themselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really, really awful to hear, but also it goes well along with the findings of the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions of Finland and Norway that are ready, that there is just this huge structural lack of knowledge among the majority populations.
Yeah.
And you really,
I think that's also kind of the main findings in kind of all commissions, that especially kind of the professionals in state and municipalities, they're and also in kind of the whole educational system, from kind of kindergarten to university, there's a huge lack of knowledge. And when you lack, when you don't have kind of knowledge about kind of Sámi real life, you end up just reproducing stereotypes rather than kind of actual kind of representing kind of real Sámi voices, Sámi lived realities.
yes, exactly. And this might lead us quite nicely to the questions of, nicely, it's awful to use that word in this context, but to continue to talk a bit more about the Truth and Reconciliation commissions that have been they're ready in Norway and Finland, or the commission part, and now there's or the final reports are published there and will be later this year, most likely in Sweden. And indeed, these should be processes that should involve the whole society, that can also see in your answers, and not just to be separated to concern the Sami community somewhere and some abstract state somewhere. So I would especially ask you about first about reconciliation. So is there feminist reconciliation that would target especially to dismantle gendered colonialism? So what would it look like, and is there such a concept?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting topic that hasn't really been kind of discussed that much, but I think a lot of researchers are kind of touching upon that. For example, the Sami scholar Ina Knobloch writes a lot about that, and also how she doesn't use kind of the word reconciliation, but a lot of her work on, for example, Sami women and their kind of activism, and also kind of focusing, for example, on land rights and environmental issues related to Sami women's activism and she's focusing a lot also on kind of how to conceptualize how to conceptualize the way people are trying to kind of take kind of a lead role in their own life, so to speak, because a part of being colonized is often that kind of your lives are told by outsiders, and the way you're talking about yourselves are also often influenced by the way outsiders have been talking about your life. And also that also involves how you relate to colonization. If you only see yourself as kind of victim of colonization without the possibility to actually kind of speak about kind of your own life and kind of the richness of Sami communities today, despite the fact that you have kind of colonization and assimilation, and trying to figure kind of new ways to talk about kind of how to continue to live Sami lives, despite the fact that people have kind of lost a lot of kind of language and knowledge and land rights, and that's also an important part of kind of reconciliation that I think also has gendered aspects, because I think we can never kind of turn back time. We cannot kind of start with kind of Sami men and women and gender roles year to the kind of 1000 and try to figure out kind of the real Sami kind of gender norms or gender relations, because that's kind of impossible, because colonization, whether we like it or not, is a part of an assimilation, is a part of the Sami lived realities today. But I think and that's also a lot of kind of scholars within, especially within kind of indigenous gender research nowadays, are kind of trying to figure out how to kind of deal with these complexities in ways that kind of not only focus about kind of what people have lost, but also what people still have, and how to kind of articulate kind of belonging in ways that also involve kind of finding out what it is to be a Sami woman today, or what it is to be, for example, queer, and how this can be linked also to the past in certain ways that is meaningful also in today's world. I think that's kind of something that I see in a lot of kind of indigenous feminist research, that it's a kind of, and I think that's also I think an important influence there is also queer research, because queer research has also a tendency to work on kind of ways we understand categories, for example, and ways we understand norms for kind of social behaviors, and also what happens when people don't kind of fit into those kind of neat categories that the society has defined for them. And I think that's also why it's a lot of kind of creative research that is happening in those fields, because it's fields that also has kind of a way of thinking outside the box, so to speak. And I think it's very fruitful when discussing also reconciliation in relation to kind of how to deal with kind of settler colonialism, and how that has kind of erased a lot of kind of how people see themselves and how people understand the world. And I think that's kind of a lot of creative work when it comes to kind of how can we see this differently, because we are not stuck into the way kind of outsiders have defined kind of what it is to be Sami today. It's also to kind of a way of resisting elimination is also to kind of define yourself, how you see the world and how you see yourself, and that in itself is a way of resisting colonization.
Yes, thank you. That's super, super interesting. To situating that question back to the Norwegian setting regarding the Norwegian Truth and Reconciliation Commission, has it been able to acknowledge gendered colonialism or gendered aspects of it?
Well, to some extent, yes, but I think kind of there's still kind of a need for kind of maybe discussing more what it is, and you need more research on what it actually means. But I think, for example, the fact that the Norwegian Truth and Reconciliation Commission was kind of established, kind of just a year or two after the Tysfjord case, for example, was an important part of, and how gender also became an important part of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's work, because this was kind of a huge debate on the Norwegian side of Sápmi at the moment when they started their work. So, and that's also a reason why Tysfjord, the Tysfjord community also got a lot of space in the final report, because this was kind of a huge debate that also had kind of a very kind of gendered aspects of it, and how colonization also marginalized people in gendered ways, and also marginalized them, and also the lack of knowledge and lack of kind of agency from the Norwegian institutions, both locally and nationally. It showed also how kind of colonization also has kind of created this kind of space where the Norwegian kind of government, both kind of local and regional and national government, had kind of avoided Sami issues because they've been also afraid of kind of doing harm, but while avoiding them, also doing even more harm, while kind of by not taking action when it's actually needed. And that's probably also has to do with kind of lack of knowledge and lack of on an institutional level, but also on kind of individual level, when kind of talking about the specific people working in different kind of in the police and in school and social workers.
Has there been action taken since the final report, and has there been proposed actions that would be effective for dismantling gendered colonialism? And if there are actions, are they taken or in the process of being taken?
Yeah, to some extent, University of Tromsø and Sámi Health Research Center, they recently got a big research project on this issue. So that's also kind of a direct result of this. That is, it's seen as an important topic for research, and I think that's also something that it's quite new. It's that I remember when I finished my master's and was thinking about taking a PhD, I kind of knocked on a lot of doors at University of Tromsø and talked with researchers there, and I mentioned to them that I was interested in kind of gender research, and I remember one of the researchers there said that, well, it was a student back in the 80s that did gender research in Sámi society, and so you don't have to do that. It's already done. So, so it says something about kind of how recent this kind of marginalization is, kind of also within Sámi research. That it wasn't kind of seen as important. It was kind of, yeah, irrelevant for research in general. So yeah, so that has kind of changed, kind of, yeah, dramatically since then. So, and that student was probably Jorunn Eikeopp, that is also a very important voice within kind of Sámi feminists. Yeah, was research and activism. So.
Indeed, that's very revealing
Yeah.
of the situation. So,
And I think also what I've been writing about is this double marginalization, that kind of Sámi feminist voices has been marginalized both within kind of research and in Sámi research and in gender and feminist research, and also when it comes to kind of activism, that kind of activism has been really dominated by kind of, yeah, other issues than gender related issues, and the women's movement in this in the Nordic countries has also been kind of very kind of non-Sami dominated, while kind of Sami feminist voices seldom has been kind of they have seldom been represented, at least to kind of a great extent. But at the same time, I think a lot of Sami feminist voices has been also kind of ignored. Like, for example, Jorunn Eikeopp, that kind of, when you look into kind of the history of Sami women, you see that there's a lot of visible Sami feminist voices and Sami female voices. We go back to, for example, Elsa Laula Renberg, and one of the most important kind of Sami politicians in history. It's not kind of coincidental that she was a woman, I think, and also the way she also got a lot of help from the women's movement back then. It's also kind of ignored issue here.
Yeah, that is a very point on observation and really important, but also something that I feel like that has been talked for quite a long time in the academia. But do you think that there has been changes, or is it still kind of in the discussions or theoretical, or are, for example, feminist movements really getting more inclusive?
I think kind of there you can see that there has been a change in the last kind of 10 years or so. That has been, and I think that has been also as a result of a lot of kind of, for example, you have the whole kind of conflict related to the NORA conference in, I think it was in 2015 or 14. I think it was 15, 16. I don't remember. But when they had kind of this poster with this kind of man dressed up as a Sami woman for the NORA conference, the Nordic Gender Research Conference, while kind of no Sami keynote speakers or no Sami voices were represented in the program, and kind of the critique that they got kind of related to that issue also changed the way the Nordic gender research environment and the conference were actually kind of, I think they actually kind of saw that they needed to include Sami voices in a better way that they had done before. And I think you can see a change kind of from that conference in Copenhagen to, for example, the conference in Iceland a few years later, and also the conference in Oslo, that kind of the latter conferences included Sami and indigenous voices to a greater extent, and they were kind of included in kind of the planning of the conference. But I think kind of And I remember also I was a part of this Nordic feminist research network back in 2015, and that was also kind of a network where we had a lot of kind of tough discussions regarding this, because and the organizers had invited some of us, those who were working with kind of Sami feminist issues, but it was a lot of quite kind of quite kind of harsh debates during the meetings that we had, that I think also kind of changed kind of a lot of these conflicts related to both the Nora conference and a lot of these different kind of networks and projects, that, and also how it was represented in kind of gender research in general also, and a lot of the journals, journals in Nordic countries actually kind of realized that they needed to take kind of Sami feminist voices more seriously and include them to a greater extent. So I think that has changed quite dramatically to the better, even though there's still a lack of researchers doing kind of gender research, but I think that's also a kind of recruitment problem. But I think if you look at kind of how many people working with gender related issues in Sami research today compared to 10 years ago, it's kind of an extremely positive development, even though it's still quite kind of small community.
But that's great to hear that the development has been such. And this actually leads us quite well to the last questions that I still have for you, and they do regard the relation between academy and gendered colonialism. And academic reconciliation as well. And I'm asking this question also from my position as a non-Sami person doing research that also relates to gender and indigenous issues. And as we know, research and colonialism are very, very connected and entangled in complex and many ways, and that there is a need for academic reconciliation. First, I would like to ask you that what is the relation and the main challenges of gendered colonialism and research?
Well, I think, as I said, I think there has been up until now a lack of representation, a lack of positions available, a lack of funding for research. I've been also I'm now in the board for the Sami research portfolio in the Norwegian Research Council, and I've been kind of working on the including kind of something about gender in that, because that has been kind of complete lack of funding for research that has kind of gender perspectives, and I think that's kind of, and but also to include it, for example, in teaching for students. I try to kind of, if I have kind of a lecture, at least one article has kind of something gender related in relation to Sami related issues in my courses, just to kind of try to recruit people, and I think kind of also that's something that is kind of slowly changing. That I think that's because we have also kind of a network of people in the different universities now that talk to each other and discuss kind of how can we kind of promote this to our students and to our kind of colleagues, and how can we recruit more people. And I think just to kind of this more kind of informal networks between researchers in the different institutions has been of great importance, because kind of it's often kind of one or two in each institution working with gender related issues, and sometimes they can kind of feel a little bit alone. But I think that there has been kind of seminars and meetings between people, and also that there to a greater extent also has been included in gender conferences, but also Sami conferences. That I think that's also very important, that both kind of Sami research and gender research as research fields to a greater extent have kind of started to talk to each other. And I think that's a huge development. It would be kind of obvious, but it's quite weird how kind of there has been kind of complete lack of communication between these fields.
Yeah, that's true. Then I have my final question that kind of splits into two. That what is the role of academia in dismantling gendered colonialism? And then what is a role of an individual researcher? If they, of course, they can't be distinguished like this artificially, but I will anyway ask it that way.
Well, I think kind of academia in general can be sometimes be seen as a quite kind of conservative institution in society. So kind of focusing on both Sámi and gender related issues is kind of in a way kind of by default seen as kind of activism and not kind of real research. So I think kind of this is also kind of a problem in general. And I see that also, even though it's not kind of that extreme in the Nordic countries that it is, for example, in the US right now. But I think that's also kind of an issue that people working with kind of Sámi research or gender research has a tendency to be kind of labeled as kind of activists. And of course, a lot of people are also activists. So it's kind of, I think it's sometimes kind of difficult to not be activist when you work with these issues, because it's, when you work with kind of, especially with kind of, issues where there's so many things that you get kind of provoked by every day, that it's kind of issues that kind of continue to exist, even though we think that the world is a better place in 2026, but these kind of oppressive structures kind of just continue to exist. So I think that's kind of something that I think it's important to kind of remember that we sometimes take for granted that it's kind of that these are kind of accepted things to work on in academia. But if you go to, for example, the US, that has been up until now kind of one of the most important countries for both indigenous research and gender research, and what's happening there at the universities is quite depressing. And even though we kind of think of the Nordic countries as a kind of safer place in the world, it's a lot of the ideologies that these movements, both within and outside academia, exist also to some extent here in the Nordic countries.
Definitely, yes. Do you still have something that you would like to comment on the responsibility of an individual researcher?
Yeah, I think kind of, well, as a researcher, I've also kind of always feel like I've been kind of this kind of activist within my own institution to kind of promote Sámi issues and promote kind of starting up. I was kind of part of the group that started up the Sámi Center, and try to include Sámi issues in all kind of relevant study programs, and taking initiatives for research projects and networks. And I think kind of often kind of individual researchers and individual university teachers can do a lot of change just by being kind of activists within their own institution, because I think a lot of kind of all everything that has been happening in academia and when it comes to Sámi research and has been a result of individuals kind of taking a stand against the more kind of conservative voices in academia. So I think kind of, for example, when the first Sámi researchers started working, they worked within kind of a world where most researchers were kind of non-Sámi people, and just to kind of the fact that Sámi people could be researchers themselves were kind of seen as kind of extremely radical in itself. It's kind of from that to the reality that we have now, where we have a lot of institutions and centers and researchers and projects that are also led by Sámi people themselves. I think that's a huge development. That where we shouldn't take kind of the individuals in the system for granted, because a lot of these initiatives have kind of are a result of often kind of just a few individuals that have kind of done a lot of work within their own institutions.
These are, of course, wonderfully encouraging words also to hear and to hear the positive development, because in these times, there is sometimes lack of them.
Yeah. And I think that's also why it's important to have networks of people, both within institutions, but also between institutions, that we can kind of have kind of these kind of strategic conversations about how to kind of make space for more Sámi perspectives in academia.
Definitely. If you don't have, okay, I've just received the first question in the chat, because I was about to say that I would like to open the floor for also for the audience to send in questions, and I will read the first question. How can indigenous feminists' voices add to the understanding of what is truth and reconciliation in the transitional justice processes in Sápmi? Big questions, but perhaps you have some additional practical examples or experiences you would like to share.
Well, I think kind of when it comes to kind of research perspectives, I think a lot of feminist research perspectives have a lot of things to give to this discussion when it comes to, for example, positionality and how the researchers are positioned and view the world, and that there's kind of that there isn't kind of a universal view of the world, and that there's a lot of different voices that kind of need to be represented. I think that's kind of one of the core contributions from feminist research, is to kind of highlight the plurality of the world. And I think that's also kind of is also highlighted when you kind of focus on indigenous feminist perspectives, because it's also a perspective that's kind of, in addition to kind of the plurality of the world and kind of feminist perspectives in general, also add the plurality of indigenous communities all around the world. And I think that's a plurality that also often have kind of, if you just look at kind of one small Sámi community with a few hundred inhabitants, that can be a kind of an extremely complex community when it comes to experiences related to colonization, assimilation, and also its effect on gender and identity and class, and and I think kind of to understand kind of truth in relation to indigenous feminist perspectives is also to accept that there's a lot of different truths, and that's important to highlight this kind of plurality of truths, rather than trying to kind of find the one and true truth for everyone. I think that's also something that is kind of I think if you want to kind of truth conciliation, you need to accept that there's a lot of different views on what this truth is, because I think it's colonization, assimilation has kind of been experienced differently in a lot of different communities and by different individuals, and even in one family with kind of parents and children, and there can be a lot of different experiences when it comes to kind of assimilation, because people experience the world differently. They are kind of they have different personalities. They have different ages. They have different relations to each other and experience the world differently. So it's it can be kind of quite different. And I think that's kind of when you look at truth that way, you also need to accept in a way that reconciliation also is kind of and must be understood in a more kind of plural way, that it's not kind of one kind of size fits all. If you want kind of a reconciliation to be successful, you also need to accept that reconciliation might look differently for different individuals. And only by accepting that you might kind of reach kind of some real sense of reconciliation, rather than this kind of stereotypical production of understanding of each other. I think that's also something that is kind of is lacking, especially in the kind of majority dominated society, is kind of the understanding of the plurality of the Sami society today. And it's kind of this kind of majority need to try to put people in very kind of narrow boxes, rather than accepting kind of the complexity of the present day Sami society.
Thank you. That was really wonderfully clearly put, and I do definitely agree that that's also, I'm myself in my PhD studying the relation of nation building and national identity. So that's really connects exactly what you said, to put people into some non-pluralist groups and painting a picture of sameness, and how far that is from the reality, and how dangerous that also might be. We have still room for at least one question. If somebody has anything in mind, please use the chat and send the question in. We can still wait for a moment for you to type. And meanwhile, Astri, if you have anything you would still like to add, feel free.
Well, I think kind of one issue that I think is important in this is also to discuss the role of art and music, because I think kind of art and music and literature has kind of the potential to also think outside the box when it comes to kind of to fantasize about how things could have been, for example, and how things can be, and that's kind of, if you write about kind of facts, you have to kind of be very kind of strict about what is real and what is not real. But if you paint a picture, or if you write a song, or if you write a novel, you're not kind of restricted to this very narrow sense of truth. And I think that can also be very inspiring for kind of how to think about the future, because I think that's something that is very much needed, that you have to kind of figure out ways of kind of thinking about what the Sami future can be. That is kind of not kind of restricted to the way we think about things here and now, that is often influenced by kind of very kind of narrow ways of understanding people and cultures and colonialism. That is more about kind of restricting people, rather than kind of seeing the potential of the creative forces of people.
Exactly, that's a really good point. And it's also interesting how in the final report of the Norwegian TRC, there was Sami art included. And now there's also in Helsinki, really recently opened a big exhibition of Sami contemporary art that has also gotten a lot of media coverage. It's been great. So there's really happening in that field as well right now, which is wonderful. We have not gotten any further questions, and we are also at the very last minute of our session. So At this point, I would like to thank you so much, Astri Dankertsen, for your insight and this extremely topical and insightful discussion. It was great to have you with us. And also, thank you for the audience for joining us today. This session will be published online on our MARCEN webpage and on YouTube, so you will find it there if you want to recommend it also further or get back to some of the questions. And on these sites, you will also find the previous sessions and see the upcoming webinar sessions. There, for example, will be one regarding the queer issues. So also that you shortly mentioned, Astri, as well. So you can see the schedule on site. And we have, in addition to that, still 2 very interesting topics as well. So feel free to join us then as well. Thank you everyone so much for joining us and have a lovely week.
Bye.
Bye.